There's still way too much fat phobia in tabletop roleplay games. Fat phobia is still a big problem in our modern day, and our hobby is far from being untouched by it. You see, the representation that you give of certain people in media affects how they are perceived in real life. There's only so many times that you can represent fat bodies as enemies, villains, and associate them with a cardinal sin before your audience begins to associate those things. It's exactly the same problem that we talked about in the Spire and Dungeons & Dragons video. We saw that Dungeons & Dragons screwed around with racism when they made the evil drow, Draergar, and deep gnomes into dark-skinned versions of good races. There's only so many times that you can darken a character's skin when they become the evil versions of themselves before your players realize that you have internalized racism you need to work on. Fat phobia is a very irrational discrimination. It actively hurts everyone because it equates health and fitness, but you can be fat and healthy or thin and sick. And on top of that, health is a pipe dream for some people, so we can't equate health with the value of a human. Most of the time, the actual reason that people are fat are genetics or wealth inequality. People who are poorer eat more processed foods and also have untreated conditions because it's really hard to get healthcare, especially in the US. So it's not due to sloth or gluttony. Fat phobia is both classist and ableist because it's based on misconceptions about class and disabilities. It's both ableist and classist. It literally harms people who think that losing weight fast is good for your health and a long-term solution. It's not. And it harms fat people because of the discrimination to the point of causing severe mental health problems triggered by the bullying. This video is not just for right-wingers. There's a ton of fat phobia in leftist spaces. We haven't done enough to combat these classist stereotypes because we have fundamental misunderstandings about fat, body image issues, and fat lives. Leftist spaces are still rife with comrades who say that you can't be an anarchist if you're not fit enough to run away from the cops. This not only excludes our valuable fat comrades, but also disabled and old comrades who would otherwise gladly cooperate with us in building a better tomorrow, if they weren't being excluded. So, if you're a leftist game master, please consider sharing this video with your players. We gotta start raising awareness of the damage fat phobia does and get it out of our culture and out of our games. In order to prove that this is a very real problem in a lot of games, I'm going to have a look at all of the character illustrations in popular games and analyze the results. They're gonna be popular by my standards, it's just the books that I had on hand when I did this video. Here's the list of the books that we're gonna be using. Anima Beyond Fantasy, all of the books, Changeling the Lost, 1st edition, Slasher, a Hunter the Vigil, 1st edition supplement, Mage the Awakening, 1st edition, Vampire the Requiem, 1st edition, Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition, Death Watch, Black Crusade, Star Wars Edge of the Empire, Pathfinder 2nd edition, City of Mist, Apocalypse World, Urban Shadows, Monster Heart, Pugmire, and The Spire. It's almost all games that I've talked about on the channel. But art is subjective, one might say. So I'm going to take all of the images in the following games rulebooks that I own, and they need one of 3 precise criteria to be considered a fat character in that game. 1. The character must be described as fat with a word that is synonymous to fat, like chubby. 2. The character is an illustration with a visible double chin. And 3. The character is a full-bodied illustration with a visible curved belly line. As we will see, games that have been published by indie developers tend to have much better representation of fat characters than big mainstream games and older games from the fatphobic beginnings of Dungeons & Dragons. By far, most fat people in illustrations of games are monsters and creatures. More than half of the fat characters I found were antagonists designed to be slain by the player characters. So, the bad guys. That's not cool for fat people. I wouldn't want to have one of my body traits singled out and associated with a bunch of villains who get brutalized in your story. So the monsters, we have Raptor in Anima, Gluttony in Anima, Adolf Brunner in Anima, the Clown in Anima, which is described as a fat, disgusting creature dressed like a mime, apparently immortal, that assassinates the players when they go too long without points. We have Argemone of Changeling, Fatso the Mutant, which is a serial killer in Slasher. We have this Seer of the Throne in the Mage Core rulebook. We have all of the Formose vampires in Vampire the Requiem. They're literally a type of vampire that feeds on fat instead of blood, so they're all fat. We have Scarborough in Vampire, and the Butcher Worm, Holger Kochfleischer in Vampire as well. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition we have the Ogres and Hill Giants, the Mainz Demon, the Nalfish Demon, the Ettercap, the Married, the Benderhob. In Deathwatch, Only War, Black Crusade and Dark Heresy we have Nurgle and all of the followers of the God of Rot, which are very often fat. In the Star Wars game we have Jabba the Hutt and a lot of other Hutts. In Pathfinder 2nd edition we have the Cyclops and the Green Hag. In Call of Cthulhu we have the cover of the core rulebook, which is a fat Cthulhu monster statue. In City of Mist, the Ally theme book features a fat person, although they are robbing the POV character, so they are made to be a villain, and also a fat man purposefully opening a clearly evil skull vase. Okay, that was a lot. You might think that we are done with all of the negative portrayals of fat characters and fat people, but we're not. Our beloved games will often represent othered characters as fat more often than they will represent regular humans. By othered, I mean something that is not human in the strict sense of the term, or if they're portrayed as humans, they also have an additional template that puts them on the other side of the uncanny valley. The examples that we have of othering are this Spring Courtier in Changeling, the Guild Artisan background illustration of a gnome in Dungeons & Dragons, this Oni in City of Mist, Shadowrun's Fat Orc Rigger, and every illustration of the dwarf race in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Also the Chapter 3 illustration of the Changeling Core rulebook. And last but not least of the negative representation of fat people, we have the association with the cardinal sin of gluttony. This type of character is either named gluttony or directly associated to the sin of gluttony by another character. All this because the culture that we live in has a strong negative connotation with the cardinal sins. Why? Because companies profit from body image issues. But why is gluttony even a sin? Greed already exists to represent the hoarding of resources. Why is being fat a cardinal sin in itself? It makes no sense, and our society needs to throw away this idea. There isn't inherently something sinful about being a fat person. The examples of sin association with fatness are this spell from the Anima Sin Magic, the Gluttony Demon in Anima. World of Darkness has gluttony as both a mechanic, gluttony demons, and a gluttony sin spirit called Balfigor, the King of Gluttony. Okay, this was all pretty terrible. If you're designing your own game or making illustrations, here's what I would recommend. Watch the Brother Bear movie and be like the Brother Bear movie. Have characters that are casually fat and treated the same as those around them. That's the category we are looking to have more often to balance the scale and also have positive representation of fat people somewhere in culture. Sadly, there aren't a lot I could find inside the few games that I searched through. Here are games with body positivity images in them. Apocalypse World represents one of its main classes, the Operator, with a fat character. Urban Shadows has the entire Power faction illustrated as a fat character doing magic. Monster Hearts has a fat character on the cover. Pugmire has in its introduction the illustration of a fat dog, and one of the two narrators of this game is Pudgy. The Spire has a fat elf that illustrates one of the classes in the newest supplement, the Kangaroo. And then there's one more thing that we need to talk about. This the strange case of mechanical representation. If you have the option to make some characters fat as a mechanical feature of the game, then it is a commentary on how the makers of the game think of fat people. For example, fat people are able to float much better than thin people, so they should arguably get bonuses to the swimming skill. Let's see if that's the case. In Death Watch, Only War, Black Crusade and Dark Heresy, you have corruption mechanics in these games that make you fat as a penalty. They're called grossly fat and corpulent immensity. They're gifts of the dark gods, the kind of like curses. It's also straight up a disadvantage in Cthulhu Tech. And that's it. That's all I could find for mechanical representation in those games. It seems that those mechanics are only made by games with some absolutely terribly often right-winged fans. I'm not quite sure what this category says about fat representation at all, but I'm sure someone who experiences fat phobia firsthand would have a better opinion on this subject than me, who's a thin person. One of the tropes that we don't see in those illustrations is the funny fat character. You know, the ones that have low self-confidence, are fat, often comic reliefs, and lucky to be in the adventure. This is still a harmful stereotype because fat people are the butt of the joke in those stereotypes. Despite being a harmful stereotype, it's too positive of a representation for role-playing games to have it, so they're kind of erased from tabletop role-playing games because no one wants to play that character, and the developers of the game don't want to be called out for, you know, being ostensibly making fun of fat people. So yeah, a lot of games are fatphobic, but we can counterbalance this. Players can play casually fat characters and game masters can do the same with NPCs. Now, am I doing any better? Not yet. I tried. I made illustrations of fat people when I made my first campaign on this channel, Rewriters of History. I was making all of the images myself from fear of copyright infringement, but I only featured some fat people because my post for volunteers whose image I would use in the game got noticed by my wife and she shared it in a body positive group. I didn't set off trying to represent fat characters, it just kind of happened that way. But it made me realize there are very few illustrations of fat people by the artists that I followed on social media. And there are few fat characters in the creative license Google images that I used for my games because I'm too tired to draw all of the characters now. So I went looking for some body positive artists. Yael Nathan, who illustrated 24 women of different body types as warriors, was my starting point, and I suggest you click on her gallery in this video's description. Now, why is this so important? Well, it's because fatphobia and body type discrimination have made the lives of many worse. So we need to fight its presence in our hobby. And fighting works. I changed the creators of Sansa's minds about the problematic presence of evil gay characters as the only official queer people of the 5 books. It worked! It was not all in vain. All of my effort paid off. As a conclusion, you should avoid buying tabletop role-playing games that have clear fatphobia in them in favor of those who don't. It will tell the tabletop role-playing game industry that we are done with the harmful body standards of the past. If you're a leftist game master, please consider sharing this video with your players. We have to start raising awareness of the damage that fatphobia does and get it out of our culture and our games. Have fun out there, everyone. We'll get through anything if we organize and work together. Please like, share and subscribe so that I can get some much needed dopamine when I log on to YouTube.